Okay, if I could ask everybody to take a seat so that we can get started. And there should be handouts on most of the chairs, but if there's not enough, if people could be nice and share with their neighbor, that would be great. Okay, I don't know if I should say good morning or good afternoon, but good day, everybody. I'm Gwen Hainsworth. I'm a senior program officer on the family planning team at the Gates Foundation. And it's really a privilege to be here with all of you today and to introduce our panel, which is the reality of using segmentation to drive behavior change. We have a very exciting lineup of speakers today, and so would like to introduce all of them. The first is Lydia Marithi. Lydia is a senior global technical and strategy advisor at Pathfinder International, where she works to champion sexual and reproductive health and rights worldwide. She directed the just concluded Beyond Bias project, a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded multi-country project that sought to ensure that young people between the ages of 15 and 24 have access to empathetic, non-judgmental, high-quality counseling and provision of a full range of contraceptive methods, regardless of their parity status, their marital status or parity. We okay? Yeah, okay. Our second speaker is going to be Leanne Doherty. Leanne is a senior implementation science advisor for the Population Council. She manages a portfolio of social and behavior change research, monitoring, and evaluation activities under the USAID-funded Breakthrough Research Project in Francophone West Africa. We also have Sakina Zaidi, who is a director at Camber Collective, a global social impact consulting firm, where she provides strategy support to governments, nonprofits, and philanthropic foundations around the world. Camber has led segmentation studies across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and North America, and believes in the importance of uplifting unheard voices in all that it does. And then last, we have Nicole Ippoliti, who is the technical director at Y Labs, a design and research organization that designs, tests, and advocates for youth-driven solutions to address the biggest challenges to young people's health and economic opportunity worldwide. She's a public health specialist and digital health strategist who brings 15 years of experience leading the development, launch, and scale of digital and service design innovations focused on improving health equity and social norm change with and for youth. So today's session is focused on the use of psychobehavioral segmentation in SRHR programs. Increasingly, we're seeing in global health programs that in the pursuit of a greater impact on health outcomes, particularly I'd say behavioral outcomes such as things like increase in modern contraceptive use, that we're seeing programs move beyond traditional types of segmentation that many of us in the room might be familiar with, such as like demographic segmentation, that focuses more on the, oops, sorry, I just realized this is not. This?
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry. You guys should have been like, hey, slides are not up. Sorry about that. So on this slide, many of us are more familiar with the demographic segmentation, which is kind of at the bottom of this continuum. But increasingly, we're seeing that global health programs in the pursuit of improved outcomes, and especially the need to better understand behaviors and what motivates those behaviors, that building on behavioral segmentation, which you see up here, which is more common for market research that's really looking at consumer behaviors and why they may be purchasing certain types of products, et cetera, that we're actually moving to kind of this level at the top, which says optimal approach, that we consider to be psychobehavioral segmentation. And that's really looking at both what change, what are the changes in behavior, but then also the why, like what are the motivations, what are the various factors that are leading people to do those behaviors, and looking at both sets of factors and segmenting populations to help inform programming. Despite the fact that we're seeing this being used more and more, including in some of the investments that the foundation funds, there's really a dearth of information out there, right? There's very little that describes how programs are using psychobehavioral segmentation, what's being learned, what's working, what's not working. And so we're really hoping with this session and with these amazing speakers to hear about a variety of perspectives and, lessons learned that can help inform this dialogue. The session has been set up a little bit different than what was described in the abstract because we really wanted to make this as much as possible a discussion. So with that in mind, we have asked all of the presenters to keep their presentations very short. They're, for the most part, flash presentations. That's why there's handouts that are on the seats, which are providing more of the context of the different projects or programs in which this work has taken place. But the presentations themselves are not going to go over that piece of kind of contextual background, but rather kind of jump to the punch and dig much more deeply around psychobehavioral segmentation. We're also fortunate enough to have both examples of quantitative segmentation and qualitative segmentation. And by qualitative, as the name would imply, it's more how do we use qualitative research that help, maybe don't look at such a broad sample in the same way that quantitative segmentation does, but really dig deep and are able to kind of surface different types of archetypes. And so Nicole's presentation will get much more deep into that, but it does offer us a broader array of examples in which we can kind of dig into. So with that, we are going to move to old school. We are not going to use Slido because many of us, I don't know about you, but many of us have been in sessions where this has not worked as well as it should. So instead, I'm just going to ask 2 questions. The first can just be a show of hands. I'd be really interested, I think all of us would be really interested in how many in the room have used psychobehavioral segmentation in their work. Okay. Great. So we hope that you can also contribute to this discussion and share your experiences as well. And then with that, is one of these mics something that I can pull out? Here. All right. With that, I would like... Hello? Okay. 5 volunteers, whoever's feeling brave. What is one thing that you're really hoping to get out of this session that will help inform us and help us steer the conversation? Anybody out there, things that you're hoping to learn or that will be covered in this session? Eileen.
I'd like us to think about this scalability and sustainability of segmentation strategies in terms of using it for implementing programs. You knew I was going to say that.
I did, but thank you very much. Any other things? Yes.
I'm Paige from Oasis, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about the pitfalls of the method and what happens when we think women or people are in a certain category, but they're not, and how that could lead us in different directions.
That is a great question. Couple more.
From the Center for Communication Programs, I'm interested in how do you do good segmentation without inadvertently putting people into a box and creating potential stigmas around some of those social norms and cultural practices.
Great. Yes, Marta?
We're all hearing about segmentation. It's a hot topic, has been for a while. I'd like to hear about when it's not appropriate to use segmentation.
Great. Okay, I have time for one last, if anybody else.
How to approach the whole conversation around segmentation as women navigate through various stages in their lives. And yes.
Great. So the question was, as women move through different segments in their lives, how do we navigate segmentation? Okay. So with that, I would like to invite Lydia. There we go. To come and talk a little bit more about what was learned under Beyond Bias.
Okay, thank you, Gwen. And I'm going to try to race through this because I have 6 minutes, so please bear with me. And I'm excited to share with you some key factors that I hope, or I encourage you to consider when integrating psychobehavioral segmentation in your programming. And these are key lessons we learned through the Beyond Bias project. And so briefly, just before I get started, to situate the conversation, just to let you know that the goal of the Beyond Bias project was to design and test scalable solutions to address provider bias in serving youth and adolescents with contraceptives. And we focused in 3 countries that were in 3 different regions: Burkina Faso, Pakistan, Tanzania. That was East Africa, West Africa, South Asia. That is important. Also, number 2, that this was a multidisciplinary project that brought together human-centered design, segmentation analysis, behavioral economics, and AYSRHR. And we were also multi-phased, and we did segmentation during the research stage of our work. So that was the first stage of our work before we went into the design stage. Why did we do segmentation? What was the purpose that we did segmentation for? We were trying actually to figure out what are the major drivers of bias, and then try to figure out what are the bias profiles of providers in terms of how these present in each context, in each country, and whether there are any trends that cut across the context. And then thirdly, try to figure out the opportunities and obstacles of shifting provider attitudes and behaviors in each country. Very quickly, through quantitative and qualitative, to begin with, on how we went through the segmentation analysis, we were able to cross-validate 11 drivers of bias across the 3 countries. So those 11, again, please do remember this because it will be relevant in our discussion, that those 11 drivers of bias were present in all 3 countries, and they can be categorized in 3 major groups. That is biographic characteristics of providers, situational circumstances within which providers operate within their clinics, and societal or social norms within which providers live. And this is the really crux of what we want to talk about. We then conducted a quantitative psychobehavioral segmentation. And a key point here is that because we wanted to come up with a solution that could be scaled across the board, again, remember East Africa, West Africa, South Asia, and we wanted this solution to be scaled across. We thought of doing this segmentation analysis by pulling a sample across, not every country, but across, and then did a segmentation analysis. So we came up with 6 segments or 6 profiles across these 3 countries. And as you can see here, that some of these segments cut across the countries, and some of them were distinct to each country. Please note that. And then in terms of the distribution or composition, you can see what really ended up happening, that we ended up with dominant segments in each country. We ended up with about 60% of average passive in Tanzania, about 60% of content conservative in Pakistan, and about a whopping 80% in Burkina Faso. So really what ended up happening, we ended up with data clustering. That's a point I would talk about later on. And then another point I wanted to note here is that in Pakistan, paternalistic clinician, that is accounting for 13%, we decided that we will not really we will not cater for that particular segment. The reason why that was a group of providers who were set in their ways, they were old, they were medical doctors that were set in their ways, and we didn't feel like we had a chance to change their behavior. So we ended up designing for 5 out of the 6. And this is just to give you a very quick summary of how the drivers manifested, because the drivers were common across the board, but then they manifested differently. Just a very quick example. When it came to LACs, for instance, you end up with providers in Tanzania being biased against LACs, giving LACs to young women because of worries about HIV and AIDS, but in Pakistan, they also are not giving LACs, but the worry in Pakistan is because of proof of fertility. So when you're doing the messaging, you really have to understand the contextual differences, and that's the kind of nuance that segmentation gave us. And at the end of the day, we ended up with a pizza, which is the drivers of bias which are common, that's a pizza crusting, and then the pizza toppings, that is the contextual elements. That's a metaphor that we used for you to understand. And so then what are the factors that we learned? Number one, utility. You really have to understand, I love the question that Martha asked. You really have to, first of all, question, what is the value add before you apply psychobehavioral segmentation, or you do or conduct psychobehavioral segmentation? Because this segmentation is time consuming, it's expensive, and it's very resource intensive. So ask yourself, what is the value add, and can you be able to do the work or find a way to get the nuance that you're looking for using demographic variables or any other way? Value add. Figure out the value add before you do it. And I'm saying this very carefully because it's become the new thing that we like to tick a box to say, donors are demanding it, yeah? And all of us are telling them we'll do it, so we just do it to tick a box without really thinking about the reason for it. Number two, ethics, and I think somebody tried to raise it. We need to think about the potential intended consequences or moral decision points, because again, remember, we're trying to think of the opportunities and obstacles. And again, when we're programming, we tend to be pushed towards impact, right? And so we are likely to be leaning towards low-hanging fruits. And the low-hanging fruits are the easier things to shift. But really, the harder to reach and the harder decision, the harder elements to change sometimes are the most difficult ones and the ones that we need to get to. So we need to think about that. And the third is scale. This really, we learned the hard way about this one. We failed in this one. I don't think we did this very well. We did end up with this pizza thing that works well in terms of scale, but particularly in Burkina Faso, because of that clustering of 80%, we ended up missing the nuance that we could have had in Burkina. So our intervention was not as effective in Burkina as it could have been because we missed the nuance. So that way, I think looking back, maybe in Burkina, where a country that had less bias than the other countries, we should have done in-country segmentation instead of just across the board. Fourthly, sequencing, especially when you're working on a multidisciplinary project that includes, for instance, human-centered design. You have to figure out what comes first. Is it segmentation? Is it HCD ideation? Because we had that conflict with HCD saying we need to be set free. We like to think and, without being tied, and then segmentation saying, but these are the segments. So think about that, and that's it.
Thank you, Lydia, for that flash presentation. Okay, so now we're going to hear from Leanne, who is going to talk about psychographic segmentation at scale, constructing measures for cross-country application.
That was close. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to present today a case study from the Breakthrough Research Project. Breakthrough Research is USAID's flagship social and behavior change research project, and we work in close collaboration with our sister project, Breakthrough Action. And I'll share some specific example today from Niger. Okay. But just to get started, a little background. If you understand or have worked or are familiar with psychographic segmentation, you know that certain individual characteristics, such as a person's beliefs and attitudes, can provide some really great insights for behavioral, trying to understand behavioral uptake and what's needed to make change. And so it's really useful when designing and monitoring SBC programs. However, despite the importance of this information, it's not really readily available in some of the large-scale surveys like DHS and PMA. And so what we wanted to do was try to show how you can collect these types of measures in a large-scale survey in a low contraceptive prevalence setting and generate behavioral insights that could lead to improved social and behavior change programming. So our study objective was to develop reproductive health audience profiles integrating socio-demographic data like age, education, and wealth, and behavioral determinant data, and that's sort of the attitudes and beliefs that I was referring to inform social and behavior change approaches for specific audience subgroups. And so we did a cross-sectional household survey with married women, 15 to 49, in the Maradi and Zinder regions of Niger, where USAID has a Rise 2 program. And we collected this data in April, May 2021. Then we used something called latent class analysis, which is a type of an analytic technique that allows you to identify audience subgroups based on patterns in the data across study participants. And the segmentation approach allows us to start thinking beyond just one characteristic at a time and instead finds relationships within the data to create these profiles using multiple characteristics at once. And so we use that information then to create personas or sort of fictional people that we could kind of attribute these qualities to help provide insights for an SBC program. So just to give you some examples of how we kind of collected this information, we looked at the behavioral determinants we looked at were knowledge, attitudes, norms, self-efficacy, and partner communication. And the types of information that we collected in our survey were, for example, with knowledge, if the woman had heard of at least 3 different family planning methods. For attitudes, we asked if she thought it was acceptable for a couple to use family planning methods, such as condoms and pills, to delay pregnancy. For norms, we asked what she thought the members of the community, if they agreed that a woman could use family planning methods. We also looked at self-efficacy and partner communication, if they felt comfortable discussing family planning methods with their partner. And then with that information combined with the sociodemographic data, we were able to generate 4 audience profiles. And as I mentioned, we gave these sort of fictional names to represent the different segments. And each segment has a percentage of the population associated with it. So our first segment is Ida. She's about 29% of the sample. She's poorer and less educated than some of the other women in the sample. She has lower levels of knowledge about family planning, less likely to believe it's acceptable to use family planning, and weak self-efficacy and low levels of partner communication. Our second persona that was developed is Bintu, who is a smaller segment, just only 7%. She's a wealthier, educated Nigerian woman. She believes it's acceptable to use family planning, and she knows where to obtain family planning methods. And we found a high association between Bintu and women who are currently using a method. The third sample, and this was our third persona, and this is our largest audience segment, was Fatu, who's 51% of the sample, and she's an older, less educated Nigerian woman, believes it's acceptable to use family planning methods, knows where to obtain the methods. She has strong levels of partner communication about family planning. And then the last segment, Layla, is 21% of the sample. And I found Layla interesting because often when we talk about the younger population, young girls in Niger, we're thinking about child marriage, early age at first birth. But we found this segment kind of emerged. There's a young, educated Nigerian woman who believes it's acceptable to use family planning methods, knows where to obtain them, believes women in their community are okay with it. And so she seemed more empowered to use FP methods. So what does this mean in terms of scalability? I know we got that question kind of early. So as I mentioned, it's been difficult to do these types of analyses previously with large-scale surveys because the data hasn't been collected in DHS and PMA. However, it is a bit exciting because PMA has just started to include these types of questions in their most recent rounds. And so that does provide options for the future in terms of looking at this type of data. So the psychographic measures that we were able to use in this study help to create more nuanced profiles that can be used for more tailored message-specific SBC programming. But we would recommend that there'd be more effort to develop psychographic measures through qualitative research that could be incorporated into these large multi-country surveys. And then finally, I think that programs really need tools that can help facilitate the use of this type of data. How do you take this type of information and operationalize it from a programmatic perspective? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leanne. So next we have Sakina, who's going to be talking about designing segmentation studies that reflect project realities.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So my name is Sakina Zaidi, and I'm here to talk about a specific project example. This is the Yuva project that was run in Bihar and Maharashtra. And I think with all things in life, usually you can find a Dilbert comic that really summarizes what you're trying to get to. The goal really for me is to tell you guys how for the UVA project, we had to focus intensely on what the segmentation would be used for. I think that gets to a lot of questions that were asked, right? The scale, the actual intervention, who's going to be deploying it, where is it going to be deployed? It is extremely important to understand what it's actually going to be used for. I think for most of us, I would qualify as kind of a nerd. I would love to do an extremely detailed segmentation. I want to know every need, every attitude, every piece of agency-related information that's possible. But in a setting where the use of the segmentation is different, it will vary how deep you want to go. So a little bit of background on the UVA project. The UVA project was unique. It was focused on Bihar and Maharashtra, and the two main interventions were going to be focused on innovative communication. So when I mean innovative, I mean really innovative. One of the things we talked about was potentially having avatars where you leave an iPad at somebody's home in a village, and the iPad learns about them, sort of the character, and then gives them advice. They remember that the mother-in-law was sick the week before. It comes back and it asks you, your mother-in-law was sick, how are you? So I mean, very different. And then also the social entrepreneurship model. The thought was that we could have a core set of UVA core members. These are social entrepreneurs that were recruited from across the two states, and these social entrepreneurs would go ahead and they would sell contraceptives, so they would really bring the supply, but they would also sell other goods. They would sell sanitary napkins, they would sell diapers, they would sell cell phones, trying to bundle all of the goods that somebody might need to sort of nudge them towards also buying contraception. So this is the context in which we were doing segmentation. As you can see, there were sort of a number of questions that we were trying to answer. Most of the segmentations that I've done in my career are usually focused on who. Which people should we target? And like that's sort of the big one. How many of them are there? What are their main attitudes? In the UVA project, we added this extra layer of complexity, but also I think what makes it interesting, we added a how and we added a what. So the how is what messages will actually resonate with these folks? What kinds of people do they want to be approached by? We asked men and women in the communities, does age matter? Does personality matter? Do you want somebody who's outgoing? Does education matter? Interestingly enough, for most women, they were sort of neutral on all things. Men were very specific that education mattered. They wanted somebody who was much more educated than them. So sort of knowing these things also makes a difference. So we wanted to try and figure that out in our segmentation. And then last but not least, we had to reserve a portion of our survey to actually figure out what products they would be interested in buying. Just to sort of give you the overwhelming nature of all of the interventions that we were trying to help inform. So there was recruiting the UVA core members, training them, then doing all of this content creation. In addition to that, figuring out how to market goods, and then also trying to understand who actually had access to a phone. How often did they use it? Did they use it to text? Did they need permission to actually use the phone? How did they get access to these things? So this was all sort of part of our broader segmentation. Ultimately, and I think some of my colleagues have really come down to this point also, it is an extreme tightrope walk. What you want is extremely complex segmentation, very, very nuanced, so you can identify every population and every thought they've ever had about contraception and how you might harness it. In reality, you need something that's simple enough for a core of social entrepreneurs to go out, to understand, to use, to implement in a way that actually makes sense to them. And this led us to sort of a few interesting things. We, had to make a few very clear design choices. And I think as you all think about using segmentation in your own work, the design choices that you make in your survey stage even, what are the questions you're asking? They really depend on how you're going to use the segmentation. So I wanted to go deep on attitudes, but of course we had to go broad. So we had to really hone in. We ended up with 19 variables that were the ones that we really thought were the drivers, and then the rest of the survey was about other things. It was about understanding what they wanted in terms of who would talk to them, what types of goods they would purchase, how they use technology. Transport symbols. This was also an interesting choice that we made somewhere in the process. Normally, as you've seen, it's profiles of women. It's sort of the personas. We've done lots of segmentations like that. And what we decided to do here is we decided to use transport symbols. So we came up with 5 segments, and it started with a bicycle, and it moved to a boat, a rickshaw, a bus, and then eventually an airplane. And really, the bicycle is the slowest and also had the lowest propensity for behavior change. And the airplane is the fastest, and these are the people that already have the knowledge, they have the agency, they have the urgency, and are more likely to use. So as a result, we thought giving the UVA core members that kind of a set of symbols would just make it easier for them. They're in the field, they don't have to refer then to all of these complex pieces. And last but not least, and this is, I don't know, it's a decision that still kind of haunts me a little bit, we did co-ed segments. One thought was that we would go to Bihar and we would go to Maharashtra, and we would get segments of women and we would get segments of men, and then we would go to UVA core members and we would say, okay, now pair them and see how many permutations and how many combinations, and then based on that, this is the couple that you're counseling. And we ended up thinking that that just wasn't going to work practically. What we also found in the data was that the attitudes and the behaviors sort of between men and women actually were quite similar. So the clusters, the ways that they were thinking about things, it was the same groups of attitudes and needs, so we could actually do this. This, however, with our implementing partners, it was hard. I think folks really were expecting a bunch of male segments and a bunch of female segments, and it took a lot of talking and a lot of working through to say, like, really, are you sure? Because I think we come from a world where demographic segmentation starts with men and women, and if you say this is not demographic segmentation, this is psychobehavioral segmentation, it's focused on attitudes, on needs, and those could be similar, even if you're a man or if you're a woman. So I think that took a lot of work. Ultimately, I think, as we go into the discussion, really want to leave you with thinking about the intended interventions and the users makes a huge difference to how you're actually going to design your segmentation. And to design a segmentation without knowing or without really actively incorporating the intended uses will probably lead to regrets in the future. The second piece is available resources. So when we think about our UVA core members, we were eventually trying to reach 600,000 couples. So trying to reach 600,000 couples means you're going to be recruiting and training a lot of UVA core members. So knowing what their education levels were like, how much time you had, how many resources you had to really help them use the segmentation was extremely important. And then this last piece on context-specific factors, I love the rickshaw, I love that we got it, but being able to make something that I think doesn't feel intimidating. I think even today we say segmentation a lot, but I think it feels like a black box. Somebody says we use latent class analysis, and they're like, what's latent class analysis? So basically trying to make it as accessible as possible. The more accessible it is, the more people understand it, the more likely they're going to be able to scale it effectively, the more likely they're going to be bought into it, and the more likely they're going to feel like it's something that's actually useful to them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sakina. And so now we're going to hear from Nicole about combining human-centered design with segmentation to design scalable yet tailored interventions that improve youth reproductive health in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thanks, Gwen. They saved the qual for last, so I'm going to have to examine that bias a little later on. So yes, I will be talking about how we at Y Labs use qualitative segmentation as an alternative approach to some of the larger scale quantitative approaches that were mentioned here today, and really how we use qualitative segmentation at Y Labs for our digital intervention in Rwanda, first to identify our priority segments for the scaling of our digital intervention, and number two, how to optimize the product for those user-specific needs at scale. I got you, Eileen. All right, so I just want to maybe begin by introducing you to the digital intervention that we'll be discussing today. Cyber Rwanda is a digital self-care platform that provides wraparound care to increase knowledge around SRH and financial inclusion, and also supports online ordering of health products and linkages to both public and private healthcare services. Cyber Rwanda is currently reaching 25,000 young people this year and over 250 healthcare providers in Rwanda. We are conducting a 2-year RCT and a cost-effectiveness study with over 6,000 adolescents ages 12 to 19, and we are this year preparing for national scale for 2023. So in preparation for scale, this year we're using a combination of midline data from our RCT, from nearly 6,000 young people, supplemented with qualitative data from 109 young people to help us understand our key priority segments and how we might need to tailor the intervention for those segments, again, at scale. So we generated 4 personas that represent different user groups which vary in technological access, agency, sexual behavior, fears and challenges, and motivations to engage with our platform specifically. And before I introduce the personas, I did want to just share some important key findings from our quantitative midline analysis, which we use to complement our qualitative segmentation. So as we are thinking of scaling this digital intervention, the team really wanted to understand what is the present breakdown of internet and phone access amongst our users, and we learned 2 very important things. So one, most of our users only had access to a phone. They did not personally own a phone, they had access to a phone, and the phone that they had access to was a feature phone, not a smartphone. And the second thing is that the young people that we are surveyed mostly had access to internet and computers and tablets at school. That's how they had access to internet. So based on our segmentation, we have determined, this is now we're moving into our personas, we determined that the anxious avoider is one of our primary personas of focus for scale. This is somebody who is in school, she engages with Cyber Rwanda at school on the tablets, and she has access to a feature phone. She does have access to cyber at school, but she is kind of challenged by the fact that there are limited tablets at school, so her ability to log on many hours on cyber at school is pretty limited. This is someone who, despite having sex sporadically, does not identify as being sexually active. And that is a really important concept for us to understand, because that means that this is a person who's not really taking proactive measures to protect against unplanned pregnancies. Therefore, she's most likely to use Cyber Rwanda in a moment of crisis. As opposed to some of the other segments who are thirsty for knowledge, they take a lot more proactive measures to kind of gain as much knowledge as they can to prepare themselves for when they're sexually active. So with that in mind, we used our standard user journey from Cyber Rwanda to help us identify key areas of investigation across each pillar of the Cyber Rwanda journey. From how they first become aware of Cyber Rwanda, to determining it's a trusted source of information for information and product access, to placing an order and engaging with various service providers. Understanding the combined demographic and psychobehavioral elements of this persona of the anxious avoider, the team was really able to think about how we were going to leverage Cyber's user journey so that we could tailor and optimize experience for the anxious explorer. So the key design changes that we included, moving into scale, is increasing her exposure to cyber by increasing the number of tablets at school, transmitting the most pertinent information on Facebook Zero, which is something that can be accessed through feature phones, as well as integrating cyber clubs in school computer labs. The other thing that we're doing is we're creating a USSD function for the platform so that anxious avoiders can discreetly purchase online products through a feature phone in a moment of crisis. So they can purchase health products through a feature phone via USSD, and that message completely disappears. A couple key takeaways from this experience. So in our experience, we have found that rapid qualitative segmentation that complements demographic data has been a really valuable alternative to larger scale psychobehavioral segmentation, really because it helps us kind of understand how we might tailor our existing intervention to better meet the needs of our priority segments. The next is that segmentation plus very intentional prototyping of the digital product, the implementation model, and the service experience really helped us to ensure that we could support equitable inclusion across the diversity of our users as we scale. I wanted to just end by just sharing a quick pros and cons of this approach. I'm going to start with maybe the bad news, which is that this approach is not really going to yield the exact percentage breakdown of the audience as shared from my other colleagues, and how those percentages could be applied to the general population. In contrast, and the good news is that qualitative segmentation is a very cost-efficient, rapid, and fairly streamlined approach towards understanding your priority segments and how you can tailor or create existing or new interventions to better meet their needs. And this is an approach that can be something that can be repeated easily as the program scales and evolves. So a lot of your questions about, well, how can we apply segmentation to people as they evolve throughout their life course, this is a great option for that. I just wanted to end by thanking our team and the partners who make this work possible. It's a privilege to talk about this project every day of the week. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, in the interest of not falling down these stairs going up and down, I'm going to sit for this next part of the session. And I wanted to kick us off with a couple of questions, and then I am going to turn to all of you for additional questions and comments. But the first question that we have is when to use and not use psychobehavioral segmentation. You know, the 4 flash presentations, I think, highlighted like snippets, but I think it'd be good to actually hear a little bit more deeply from some of you on this, because Lydia, you mentioned even in your presentation, you know, it's not always the right thing to do. So maybe I'll start with Lydia, and then if others would like to add in based on your own experience.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think certainly when not to use behavioral segmentation is when you want to please a donor and when you want to win the proposal. And for the donors, when you just want to sound your request for proposal to sound like it has a hip in it. A highly impactful practice. No, I honestly say this because I just have noticed that lately, and taking on Beyond Bias project, and coming into the segmentation, and trying to figure out how to apply it, and finding it within the USAID highly impactful practice, and trying to find information about how to apply it, and I couldn't find anything. And for the life of me, we struggled. And Gwen, you know how much we struggled to figure out how to apply it. And I'm like, how did it become a hip if we didn't know how to apply it, right? And then, you know, we try to find our way around it. But then also, one thing I've learned, every time anyone is doing psychobehavioral segmentation, they reach out to me because they know I'd been struggling with it. So then it's not a secret that people don't know how to apply it, but we seem just to be putting it there because we are all telling each other it is a highly impactful practice. How is it highly impactful practice when we can't really tell what the value add for it is? You know? So that's why I keep saying, what is the value add? And I think donors should first of all demand that if an implementing organization cannot spell out what the value add for segmentation is, they have no reason to put it in their proposal. And also for you donors, you have no reason to ask for it really if there's no need for it, you know? Because it's resource intensive, it's very expensive, it's time consuming. We are using resources that we could have used doing something else. And then we're introducing language, you know? It's complicated. And then now we have also, we come up with interventions that are even now more complicated to scale because we're introducing more complication. All because we want to sound rigorous and great. So don't do that.
Okay, would anybody else like to complement Lydia's remarks? And you know, in particular, when do you think it's useful?
Sure, I can take a pass at that. I think Lydia is 100% right that you need to know exactly how you're going to use it. I think the other piece of that, though, is you need to have partners that know how to use it and that have the skills and the desire to use it. I have been on several segmentation projects where the starting partner knows exactly how they're going to use it, but the people who are going to be implementing, you know, they don't like it, they don't believe in it, they don't want it. So I think it's something to do also with just partner interest and willingness. The other piece that I've thought about a lot is sort of this like marginal benefit. So if nobody has ever done any type of segmentation at all, and there's mass messages completely generalized, you probably don't need a psychobehavioral segmentation. You could probably start with a qualitative segmentation and exponentially increase the effectiveness of your messaging without putting in the cost. I think these types of psychobehavioral segmentations become very helpful when you've sometimes stagnated on the results that you're able to see. Because what we have found, and sort of like from the integrated behavioral model, what we found is psychobehavioral segmentations, those are the most predictive of behavior change. So demographics will tell you some things, right? Behavior just will tell you some things, but if you want to be somewhere where you can predict behavior change, that's what you should do. You should do a psychobehavioral segmentation. So if you've stagnated and you can't figure out how to kind of get over that next hump, FP uptake is not increasing, then maybe it's a chance to actually invest that money to get you over the hump.
Yeah, I'm just gonna make a plug once again for qualitative here. Just to say that, I'm like, look, we used it, I think, so in Beyond Bias, you use quantitative segmentation at the outset, right? Is that correct? Okay, so in what we just did, this is, we're, you know, a year and a half into launch, we're preparing for scale. This is was a nice opportunity for us to do a real quick pressure test of like, are we headed in the right direction? And had we not done something like this, there's no guarantee to say that we would have, for example, added the USSD function or really understood that this is our main persona is someone who is looking, who is not accepting the fact that they're sexually active. They don't identify as someone who's sexually active, and therefore, because of that, they do need information in a moment of crisis, and they need it in a really discreet and direct manner. And so understanding that about this persona really allowed us to think about how we can optimize this digital intervention when we're planning for scale to make sure that we are meeting the needs for our priority users. So it doesn't have to be something that is super time intensive or super robust, although those are great, but like if you're looking to use segmentation to optimize an existing intervention, that's when I would recommend it.
Great. We had some other questions that we wanted to cover, but I'm also cognizant of time, and I really do want this to be a discussion and to hear questions and comments from all of you. So one thing that I did want to add to the discussion as a donor who funded some of this work is, I guess from my vantage point, I struggled a little bit around this question and how it relates to application, right? Because I think in some of the investments, the segmentation was done, and then the project still tried to reach everybody, right? And so then the question became, well, how do we apply this? Does this mean we have to go and have some kind of tool that segments every single person that we're trying to reach, which came up in UVA, came up in Impacto Niger. I'm looking at Eileen, who did some further research looking at that after the fact. But I also know within the foundation, there are other teams that are investing in segmentation, and they're using it a bit differently. They're actually doing the segmentation to actually help them figure out which segment do they need to target to solve for that problem. And then because it is more in depth, it's not just looking at the behavioral piece, but also the why piece. What are those underlying motivations and factors that are leading to the behavior? They're using those factors to then help them design a more effective intervention to reach a particular segment. And Lydia, I'm looking at you because you remember we tussled around this extensively with providers, right? Like, do we pick a couple of those provider segments that those are the only ones we want to hone in on? Do we find a way so that the interventions the content could somewhat be tailored? And I do think when it's a digital intervention, it's a little bit easier because then you can actually embed certain things within that digital solution that helps, identify, okay, it's this particular segment, and then maybe there's specific tailored content for that segment. But I think when it's not digital, it gets a little more complicated. So hopefully we'll have time to talk a little bit more about the application. But before I turn it over to folks, I wonder if anybody would like to very briefly touch on Eileen's question, which is around the scalability piece, which is a really thorny issue, I think, that we've all been grappling with. I don't know Looking around, who wants to take that? Leanne?
Yeah. I know kind of while we were preparing for this, we talked about the scalability question at multiple levels. And so when I am thinking about scalability, I'm thinking about it from, the data perspective, how are you going to get the measures? And so that's what we were talking a little bit about, how are you going to get the data that's going to be able to create the segments? And from our experience, it's not readily available. And so the question is, how do you begin to generate that type of information more, as I was mentioning in the PMA and DHS surveys? And how do you find measures that can be used across countries? Because often this is really specific. You have to go in and do sort of deep qualitative research to understand what those drivers are, and it may not be consistent within even a single country, let alone multi-country. So I think a lot more work is actually kind of needed to try to figure that out.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that was a struggle for us in Beyond Bias. And again, because we're trying to strive for an intervention, again, that could be scaled across the board, ambitious, we tried to do a segmentation across the board, but as you can tell, we then lost the nuance. And so segmentation is fragmentation of information. And so when you fragment, then you get nuance. But then when you get nuance, you can't scale. So there's this tension between the two. And I struggle a lot with it because at the end of the day, what I feel or where I'm headed is, by the time you lift to get to a point of scale, you're really at the point of demographic variables. You've lost so much nuance, and you're at the back at the point of demographic variables. So then that's why I go back to, can we do it, psychobehavioral segmentation at scale? Maybe that's a question for Sakina. Because, and again, maybe I'm wondering, are there times where maybe we have situations or questions that need to be answered that are contained maybe in a particular context that we can apply segmentation in that way? That it's particular contextual elements and situations, then that way it is applicable, but not things that need to be scaled at the national level. Because honestly, by the time you get into the national level, you're getting back to the demographics, according to my experience.
Okay, I'll take the bait. I think one of the things that it comes down to, honestly, is just a little bit, segmentation, the way that we have seen it, it is a little bit of art and a little bit of science. And I think to be sitting and saying it's just science and it will be perfect, it's probably not true, right? But I think the part that does come down to, you want it to be scalable. But I think that represents a pretty large investment. So what that means is if you want a segmentation that's scalable, you probably have to do a nationally representative survey with sampling that is nationally representative, that doesn't have bias. And I see some nodding, right? Like, it's hard to do that. But I think to the extent that you can lean on the science there, the chances of it being scalable are better. I think that, in cases where you do your segmentation in just Bihar, and then you expect it to be able to scale to all of India, or if you only have budget to do it in 10 districts, but then you're using that segmentation to try and apply to a 600,000 person intervention, it becomes more challenging to actually have it be representative.
I'm wondering, there were several folks in the room that raised their hands saying that they actually use psychobehavioral segmentation in their work, and I'm wondering if there's anybody, I'm seeing that, that would like to complement what you're hearing here in terms of scale.
Steve Kretschmer with Desire-Line. I would completely agree with you, and a lot of what's been said. One of the things is we need to look at what we're trying to achieve to begin with, right? And it comes back to what you indicated, that my background originally is commercial market research, and in commercial market research and the commercial market, we can pick and choose and select and say, here's the segment that we're going to go after, and we can leave behind everybody else. In public health, we can't do that. In the transition over to public health, the original work I did was in male circumcision for HIV prevention. The first time that I was involved and this was sitting on a panel representing commercial market research to say, how would we sell male circumcision to men and achieve 90% coverage? And commercial sector would just walk away from it. That's what we would do if you want the honest answer. But if we're actually going to do this, we need a nationally representative sample that is correctly sample design. And then using particularly a lot of what has been mentioned is upfront qualitative deep dives into understanding, particularly from behavioral science side, what are the underlying drivers of those behaviors? Then quantifying those, segmenting on those, and now what you've got is segments that are really grounded in the underlying drivers of the behavior. And what we've found over time, the original segmentation that we did 10 years ago in VMMC in Zambia and Zimbabwe are still valid 10 years later. Because we got to the underlying human drivers of the behavior. And so I think if we take that approach, but it's only applicable where we have identified that the traditional approaches are failing, then the question is making that huge investment to do that quantitative sampling and all of that, what does that get you in terms of achieving what you're trying to address?
Thank you very much. Other questions, comments from the audience? Yes.
Thank you, Gwen. I also was kind of placing this in the provider's side. How do you do segmentation there? 20 seconds background and my question. So the government of India has launched a very large program of introducing school health and wellness programs, READ CSE, in schools. So they are training teachers, 2 teachers per school. So we tried to do a psychometric assessment of what kind of teachers would be best to deliver a program like this. So we looked at factors like gender biases, confidence, willingness to change, embarrassability, et cetera, kind of cross-tabbed with gender, age, education qualification, marital status, et cetera. We created personas. Then we realized that even if you belong, 3 of us belong to the same persona, how we behave really depends on the ecosystem, right? So if I'm a teacher in a school where the headmaster is very supportive of CSE, where there is a policy mandate, where my co-teachers don't make fun of me because I'm talking about sex, or children find me very popular because I'm talking about it. So what we're struggling with is how do you balance when the same persona is transported into a different ecosystem? So and especially in the context of scaling, because in scaling you don't control the ecosystem. So I'm just adding another kind of complication into the mix. But when you scale, how do you take into account ecosystem and how it works on the personas? Thank you.
Good question. Do you want to take a stab?
It's a perfect question. I wish I had an answer though. You make a very good question. And I think it's the same question I've been asked and why I'm struggling with segmentation, because we were doing this work and we segmented across 3 countries and hoping that the work we're doing in Pakistan can inform Bangladesh at least, right? And then when that started and we came up with this profiling tool for Bangladesh to take the segmentation work we had done and have a profiling tool so they can check whether those profiles exist there. The question then we were getting was, are we just assuming that Bangladesh is exactly the same as Pakistan? Is that the assumption that we have to make for that to happen? And then we move from, okay, do your primary, formative research qualitative and try to supplement, what we've already done. And see whether there's new ones that you can find. And I think that's where we are really, and that's how far we've gone so far, where we try to say that we've done the groundwork of doing this very heavy lifting of segmentation that was very expensive and time consuming. And so trying to assume that there's some level of similarity in terms of the region, but then not really assuming all the way in such a way that we're just replicating it, trying to do some background research or situation analysis or assessment, and then see whether they fit in and what doesn't fit in. Case in point, actually, we did have a segmentation analysis done in Senegal that was national level, and it was being replicated in Niger. It was the opposite, right? It was Niger being replicated in Senegal. And actually what they did is after they did the qualitative research, what they found is that there was a particular segment that didn't exist in Niger that existed in Senegal, so then they added it. But that whole thing, though, doesn't quite answer your question fully, and I want to kindly just accept and acknowledge that it doesn't. We're just barely, scratching the surface on that, and I don't think I have the full answer. Sakina, do you have any thoughts?
Keeps pulling me in. I think that this is the part where it comes down to a little bit more of the art, right? So this is more of the art than the science. But the integrated behavior model that I referred to previously, it acknowledges that your environment does have an impact on whether or not you're going to do a behavior. I think the reason, though, why I believe in sort of the psychobehavioral segmentation is even though your environment has an impact, it does not have the most impact. The thing that has the most impact and is the most predictive is your attitudes, your beliefs, and the norms. Like, those are the things. So because you can't control everything, you pick the thing that is most predictive, and then you try. But yeah, acknowledging that that's the art.
So I'm wondering if we can challenge that a little bit, because I think both Nicole and I are looking at each other. I mean, do we empirically know that environment is not the biggest factor? Because I would argue sometimes it can be. Yeah. And we saw even with the segmentation with Beyond Bias, right? I mean, the workplace and the environment in which providers were working sometimes was one of the top drivers. Because environment, even if your attitudes at an individual level, you're committed, et cetera, if your environment is such that it does not allow you to act in the way that you want. So I don't know, I'm
no. And I think, to say that, environment doesn't matter, of course, isn't true. But I think even within attitudes, it depends which attitudes, right? So is it your attitudes around agency? So like, if you're the kind of person where you believe what you believe regardless of environment, then probably it will impact. But acknowledging that, of course, especially in a provider setting, it's challenging.
Yeah. Yes. Holly, Amy.
Just a kind of contribution to add to that, because I was actually thinking about what Sakina had presented around the couples, and are you matching the profiles of each of the couples? And I wonder if there couldn't actually be almost like a profiling of the environment. And then you factor that into the combination.
Amy?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm curious if those on the panel or anyone in the room has thought about collecting these learnings to kind of help us with a rubric on knowing when it is worthwhile to do this kind of segmentation, when it's not, when we should just test and contextualize previous profiles to see if they might actually work in a new space, or when to just go with the other kind of segmentation. Because I'm being self-serving at USAID, we're gonna see it in every single proposal I anticipate, and so, we'll want to know how those decisions can be made. And I'm also kind of curious, like, have we thought about, in terms of the behavioral outcomes that we want to see, is this worthwhile for any behavioral outcome, or should we start separating those out, like increase contraceptive use or change social norms? Which does it work better for, or vice versa? Is it worthwhile for all things that we want to see? Thanks.
Maybe I love that question so much, but I think that's a paper that is long overdue. So I'm looking at you, I'm looking at Gwen. It needs to be funded. It needs to be. No, but honestly, I do think it's a piece of work. I think actually it should have been done before we started jumping into the bandwagon of thinking it's a hip. Because for me, I feel like that's where we went wrong. I mean, not really going wrong, but I feel, I just find like there's a gap where, how did we determine that this was a highly impactful practice before we knew how to apply it? I can't still wrap my head around that, because when I tell you we struggled in this project to figure out how to apply this analysis, and then reach out to almost everybody and comp the internet, trying to figure out how to apply it, and we couldn't find it. And I'm just like, how did this then become a highly impactful practice? So I think maybe we need to dial back a little bit and figure out and come up with that guide, you know, as a field, and learn first, you know, and maybe then, and maybe also the mistakes that we've made so far, maybe will help inform us. Maybe at the end of it all, it will be helpful that we've made the mistakes that we made, or we've done what we've done, and that we've gained the lessons that we've gained, and maybe borrow from those now, and take time to, you know, stop and now develop that. I think actually that sounds to me like the next thing that ought to happen.
Thanks, Lydia. Yes, I'm going to pick on you in 1 second. I was realizing also that I had asked for 5 people to volunteer in the audience in the beginning, and some of those questions have been answered, but not all of them. And so I was curious if any of you had thoughts. There was this question about kind of almost like stigma of segmentation, and how, you know, kind of the issues that might go around kind of putting somebody in a box. And I'm looking at you, Sakina, because I don't know if there was any learning, even thinking about the icons that you picked, right? Like within that context, right, a rickshaw probably has certain connotations versus an airplane. And not that people necessarily knew they were a rickshaw, but wondered if you had any thoughts on, any of you had thoughts on that. And the other question that we didn't quite answer was the one around as a young person or any person moves through different kind of life stages, and what that may mean for segmentation. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on those two. And then I will, if we have time, get to you.
Gwen, I think that question is a really good one. We think a lot when we're trying to name our segments. I think when we started off, there was a lot of, you know, the like conservative traditionalist, or like the will never say yes, and like stuff like that. And I think you just have to be extremely careful in how you name them. I think one of the attempts with the icons was to try and remove a little bit of that stigma, while also trying to convey some sort of information to the people who would be using the segments on like what the segments were thinking about. But I think that is a really good question, and I think that's just sort of in terms of nuance, and probably in terms of dealing with sort of partners on the ground, to think about how can you name segments in a way that's not going to be off-putting or offensive even, to actually end up in a segment. Yeah.
Right. Anybody else? Leanne, do you have thoughts on this?
So we actually presented the parts of this earlier in the year, and actually had a participant in the session really kind of voice some concern about it, and was saying that in our context, in our culture, this type of segmentation is not appropriate. And so we ended up having a separate conversation after the session and talked about it a little bit more, and kind of worked it out in terms of, you know, well, the purpose is really to figure out who really needs to be targeted to help them improve their health outcomes. You know, it's not to sort of like create divisions within your community and your culture, which was yeah, which was a concern. So I think just being really clear on the intentions, that it's related to trying to improve health outcomes and make better health systems for people that are involved. I think you also asked about the life stage, and I was thinking that we've talked about the psychographic and about when to use. In the past, when I've been involved in segmentation and the demographic segmentation, it's been more for policy purposes than for sort of behavior change purposes. And so I think that's something to bring to the conversation too, is that sometimes you can do segmentation because you're trying to shift, you know, wealthier clients to the private sector, which is something in the total market approach, versus maybe looking more at a targeted social and behavior change approach, where you want to try to figure out who, should you tailor your messages to sort of reach specific individuals or segments of the population that are not using services.
Great. Okay. I think we do have time for.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Arzum Chalola with the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, and I really appreciated this panel so much. But I have to say that as someone who's been doing social behavior change for nearly 30 years now, it really surprised me when you said that you couldn't think of how to apply what to do with the segmentation. I can think of a dozen ways to use segmentation. You give me this rich data, I can tell you a million things to do, really. It's fantastic, and I hope no one leaves this room thinking we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So maybe we don't have the funds to do as rigorous, as beautiful segmentation as described here. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do segmentation. Because if you have a general message, you'll reach no one, because no one will see themselves in that message, or an intervention, or an approach, or whatever it is you're trying to do. People need to see themselves and understand how it affects them, how it benefits them, why it's important for them. So yes, it's expensive, yes, it takes time. If we can do it, we should definitely do it, but if we can't, we have to segment as more than just demographics. And at CCP, we've been doing segmentation in a more simple way, but still including knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, all of that for decades. So let's please segment.
I'm Eileen Spicer from University of North Carolina. I just want to give a slight counter of it potentially being overused. Now, I'm saying this to the funder who did it. So there was a case in Niger where when I'm still trying to find out if it's been scaled up, but segmentation was used. Canberra Collective did a nice job of segmenting, but then it was taken to the next level where every client is asked 12 questions and put into a box and counseled based on the box she falls in, and that goes into her folder. And the question about changed, now that she's a user, she might be in a different segment, but it's still in her folder of her segment. So all this evolving issues of changing segments, life course, and being put into a box that might not counsel you on all methods, which is really what we want, may be an application of overuse. So in my mind, I'm thinking about the case where I've seen it kind of overuse versus underuse. So I want to throw that out there. Gwen knew I was going to mention that one.
Gwen, can I just jump in maybe like 1 second? So I think what we need, back to Amy's point, is that we do need some kind of rubric or guidance document about when it's appropriate to use segmentation and when it might be not as advantageous. I want to just second and echo your point over there that it is anytime we are thinking intentionally about what the different subsets of our users might need, that's an excellent exercise and something that we should be doing repeatedly. And it could vary in terms of the resources and the time and the human capital that we put into it, but any kind of reflection and interrogation of that is well worth the effort. I think that it is clear though, and I hope you fund this, Amy, starting next year, that putting you on the spot, and we're recording this, okay, that we definitely need some kind of guidance document to help us evaluate when it's appropriate and when it's not.
Can I say something? And I think when I say in terms of using segmentation and the value add, I want to put it upon us, because if you can define the value add, then you'll do the kind of segmentation that is advantageous that you can use. That's where I'm coming from. I'm not saying don't segment. I'm just saying before you segment though, figure out what value it's gonna give you and define that value first. Because I'm telling you, the field has a reputation. I'm just saying because if I can, I swear, get a dime for everyone who reaches out to me to say, I have this segmentation, how do I use it? Then I'll be rich. If we can figure out, first of all, what the value is, even before we put it in our proposals, then segment. Because then when you find the value, then you know even the kind of segmentation you need to do. Sometimes some projects, actually what they've learned is, after the fact of already running their budget of segmentation, that actually that's not even the kind of segmentation they needed to do.
So we have 2 minutes, and I'm going to actually use that 2 minutes for the floor to kind of wrap us up on some of these points, because I think what's been really nice about this session is the honesty and some of what's worked and some of what hasn't and what we're grappling with. I would say, though, from my perspective, I mean, I hear you, Lydia, and I agree with it, but I think for me, and I'm just looking at it as a donor who has funded different projects that have included this, I think sometimes what does happen, to Lydia's point, is people throw it in there because it's a buzzword, and they haven't thought through the strategy. Are they segmenting because they want to target a specific segment, and therefore they're going to design a set of interventions around that segment? You know, are they going to use it in some other way? Like I said about digital, like they're going to roll something out that already innately has an ability to figure out kind of nuances around segmentation and in some ways quickly on the fly segment folks and then have more tailored content. I do think some of the tension, at least for some of the projects, I'm thinking about UVA, Beyond Bias, et cetera, was that those were more like programmatic investments that were not from the get-go saying we want to target a specific segment, right? I mean, so segmentation was in there without anybody, quite frankly, on the program side, figuring out like, what decisions are we going to make around this? Are we going to, for example, pick the biggest segment because that's going to potentially allow us, you know, the greatest scale? Are we going to pick a particular segment because they're most amenable to change? I mean, those things hadn't been thought through, and I think that's okay. That's why we do these sessions, so that we can learn and share, so that any of you who are thinking of doing segmentation can take all of this and be thinking about some of those questions early on. But I do hope, I agree, I hope what the takeaway is not that we shouldn't do segmentation, but I do think it is more we should figure out ahead of time when it's valuable and how we're going to use it. I see you want one last word. We are closing, but I will entertain you.
Sorry, just to comment on this issue of segmentation and programs. I think a lot of times the approach that we're taking is dividing implementation and programs from the research. We see this even in the grants themselves. This is a research grant, that's an implementation grant. As opposed to, you know, what is the research, and using segmentation actually as predictive models. So you create your predictive models. Here's what we're trying to achieve. Create your predictive models, and then take those as the insights that go into the program. We're designing our programs, and then we're saying, oh, let's do a segmentation. As opposed to doing a segmentation, using that as a predictive model to look at what we're trying to achieve, and then design our programs based on what we have as insights and predictive models. One last thing on scale is you don't always have to use the typing tool and identify everybody individually. You can use self-selected attention, right? This is what advertising is all about. So when you identify very clearly, you know, here's what they want, here's what they think, here's who they are, and you message to that, the people will pay attention and you can reach at scale.
Because it resonates with them. Thank you. Those were some great concluding remarks. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to all of our panelists.